The 1920s were the years of Manhattan's Black Renaissance. It began with Shuffle Along, Running Wild, and the Charleston. Perhaps some people would say even with the Emperor Jones, Charles Gilpin, and the Tom-Toms at the Provincetown. But certainly it was the musical revue Shuffle Along that gave a scintillating send-off to that Negro vogue in Manhattan, which reached its peak just before the crash of 1929. The crash that sent Negroes, white folks, and all rolling down the hill toward the Works Progress Administration. Shuffle Along was a honey of a show. Swift, bright, funny, rollicking, and gay, with a dozen danceable, singable tunes. Everybody was in the audience, including me. People came back to see it innumerable times. It was always packed. To see Shuffle Along was the main reason I wanted to go to Columbia. When I saw it, I was thrilled and delighted. It gave just the proper push, a pre-Charleston kick to that Negro vogue of the 20s that spread to books, African sculpture, music, and dancing.
If you were a theater kid back in 2016, you probably spent the evening of June 12th watching the 70th Annual Tony Awards. It was a packed season full of monumental new shows like Waitress and Hamilton, huge revivals, James Corden nonsense, even a clip of my high school production of Fiddler on the Roof, I'm not kidding.
That just happened on the Tonys.
And historic wins for black actors sweeping the musical acting categories. Leslie Odom Jr. for Best Actor, Daveed Diggs for Best Supporting Actor, and Renee Elise Goldsberry for Supporting Actress, all from Hamilton. And our feature film Elphaba, Cynthia Erivo, won for Best Actress for the revival of The Color Purple. Hamilton and The Color Purple were the focus of a lot of attention that night, as both represented black actors in a way rarely seen on Broadway, let alone in the same season. And yet, early on in the evening, you might have been flabbergasted to see another musical take the stage, featuring a veritable who's who of Black Broadway. Brian Stokes Mitchell, Billy Porter, Brandon Victor Dixon, Joshua Henry, Adrienne Warren, and six-time Tony Award winner Audra McDonald, pregnant and doing things like this. The show had the exhaustive title of Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921 and All That Followed. It was directed and adapted by the legendary George C. Wolfe and featured exuberant, thrilling choreography by none other than Savion Glover. This musical was nominated for 10 Tonys that evening. No nomination for McDonald, a scandal, but walked away empty-handed. Despite the enthusiastic response from the audience that night at the Tony Awards, this musical couldn't sustain and would close a month after the telecast after only 100 regular performances. What was this show with the old-timey music and ebullient tap dancing? And how did so many Broadway legends come to collaborate on a musical that seemingly wouldn't last? To answer these questions, Gerald and I are turning to two resources. First, we must look back over 100 years to the musical that is a landmark of not only Black Broadway, but Broadway history as a whole, Shuffle Along. And second, we must look back about, say 22, 23 years ago, to the Los Angeles County High School for the Arts. Before Gerald was a twinkle in Cody's eye, the two of us attended an arts high school in Los Angeles, and one of our friends was a fella named Phillip Attmore. He was a dance major, but more specifically, a very musical theater-style tapper. For example, as is the case with most theater kid parties, we each have a trick we can bust out. Mine happens to be a pretty damn good Colm Wilkinson impression. 2, 4, 6, 1. It's really good. Phillip's was to execute Moses from Singin' in the Rain to a T. It came as no surprise to any of us that he eventually ended up on Broadway. Phillip Attmore was in the original cast of Shuffle Along, or The Making of the Musical Sensation of 1921 and All That Followed, playing the roles of William Grant Still, amongst others. He's also been an all-around song and dance man in no less than 6 Broadway musicals, including the latest revivals of Hello Dolly and On the 20th Century, just to name a few. Even though Phillip is out there in NYC living his Anne Reinking dreams and I'm out here teaching you musical theater history lessons on YouTube, we've still remained friends over the years. So, when I wanted to do a history lesson episode on Shuffle Along, I asked Phillip if he wouldn't mind coming on to Stealing Focus and talking with me and Gerald about that revival production. Luckily, he said yes. So, Phillip, tell us how you came to be a part of the revival of Shuffle Along.
I love this question. So I didn't actually audition for Shuffle Along until late into the process. They had done multiple what are known as labs throughout the year of, I believe it was 2015. And during that time, I was doing On the 20th Century on Broadway. And I was set to do bandstand at Paper Mill Playhouse. And then one of the producers, essentially, when they offered me Shuffle Along, I had to do 2 of the last labs, like studio development labs, in order to then do the Broadway production. And so I came in one of the last kind of additions to the cast, but I was glad that I went in then, because at that point, the role that I ended up playing in Shuffle Along hadn't fully been developed yet. I remember my audition, it was George C. Wolfe was there, Savion Glover was there, and they essentially, it was kind of a hodgepodge of learning a combination and then kind of shuffling us all around and putting us in different groups. And at one point we had to do kind of an improv tap circle with Savion, and then we all had to sing.
Stop it. You had to do an improv tap circle with Savion Glover?
Oh, yeah. That's a standard when it comes to, the tap world, the tap family. And
yeah.
So they had to kind of, see how we did with learning choreography and then see how we did with improvisational skills, which is very much a part of tap culture. And so, yeah, it was a great audition, and they offered me a slot once I kind of sorted my way through, sadly having to leave the Paper Mill production of Bandstand. I joined Shuffle Along, and so it was like the fall of 2015 that we did those labs. And so I had just gotten married, actually, and came back from getting hitched and jumped right into rehearsals. And yeah,
wow.
I mean,
Shuffle Along is a work of art that incorporated jazz in multiple ways: music, dance, fiction, and lyricism, while also being hailed by no less than Langston Hughes as kicking off the fabled Harlem Renaissance. It was the first Broadway musical to feature a score composed fully of jazz music, and while not the first to feature an entirely black cast, it was one of the first musicals written and produced entirely by African-American creatives. Shuffle Along transcended racial boundaries, as it was popular with both white and black audiences, and the show's groundbreaking use of tap dancing choreens would influence the art form as a whole in the decades that followed. Therefore, in many ways, Shuffle Along is the apotheosis of all things New York jazz in the 1920s. When it came to popular entertainment on stage in the late 19th and early 20th century, the options would range between European-style operettas, vaudevillian variety shows, and minstrel show comedy sketches, which would involve white performers in blackface portraying African-American stereotypes. For black performers, their options were extremely limited, for while many were educated and gifted artists, in order to work, they had to operate within the system, with black performers themselves forced to don blackface.
We actually went on a cast field trip with George C. Wolfe, with Savion Glover, and we all took a trip to the Guggenheim, and there had been a film that was untitled that had been lost for, at that point, just over 100 years. And it was a film starring Burt Williams, who was a famous black silent movie
I know
star.
Burt Williams.
Yeah,
he was a big on the minstrel. He was a big minstrel show star. Yeah.
He was someone that we definitely did our research on, and it was essentially snippets. It was an unfinished film that was lost for over 100 years. But what was interesting about the film is that it was evidence of the impact of Black culture in media, that predates to where we think Black artists had impacted media in terms of the stage and film and whatnot. And, obviously one of the benchmark ideas of Shuffle Along in terms of, just telling the full story is how the original Shuffle Along essentially introduced what you would now see in sort of a musical theater formula, with singing and dancing and acting and jazz music and syncopation. It all kind of was birthed from the creators of Shuffle Along and the people that they were associated with, all the Black artists that they kind of ran with. So
There was a shift with the early 1900s, though, as minstrel and tom shows had been replaced by all-black musical theater and vaudeville companies. Thus, light operas with all-black casts began to pop up sporadically on Broadway throughout the 1900s and 1910s, such as In Dahomey in 1903 and His Honor the Barber in 1911. As the 1910s waned on, though, the amount of all-black Broadway musicals dissipated due to the passing of many of the creatives who wrote these shows, and black companies like the Black Patty Troubadours, the Smart Set, and the Negro Players all hit the road as national touring companies. However, as vaudeville surpassed minstrelsy, and as the country emerged from World War I, a new generation of artists were materializing. Two such artists were the vaudeville music team of Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake. With Blake on the piano and Sissle on vocals, the two men were able to scrape by as working musicians throughout the 1900s, eventually being asked to join noted band leader James Reese Europe's New York Society Orchestra. Through Europe's work with the popular dance team of Vernon and Irene Castle, white audiences were exposed to his band's syncopated ragtime music. Europe was a mentor and inspiration to both Sissle and Blake, for the men in his all-black orchestra were always dressed to the nines, donning no less than tuxedos. Therefore, if Europe, and by extension Sissle and Blake, had not yet created a musical theater for African Americans, they had managed to work within a parallel performance form to replace the negative stereotypes of a bygone era with a vastly more positive image. After traveling to Europe with Europe during World War I as part of his 369th Infantry Hellfighters Band, Sissle and Blake returned to the States and founded a new vaudeville act, the Dixie Duo. The team performed frequently on the predominantly white Keith circuit throughout the late 1910s, yet they maintained the lessons of their mentor, for they dressed only in tuxedos and never performed in blackface. It was in 1920 when Sissle and Blake performed at a benefit concert for the NAACP at Paul Laurence Dunbar Theater in Philadelphia, when they were fatefully introduced to the comic team of Flournoy Miller and Aubrey Lyles. If Sissle and Blake were fighting against the stereotypes of their chosen profession, Miller and Lyles actively adopted them in order to subvert expectations. Both men came from performing arts families that worked in vaudeville and minstrel shows, and when they later attended Fisk University, Miller and Lyles would form a comedy team. Their experience at Fisk led the men to the Pekin Stock Company in Chicago, the first professional company in residence at a black theater, where they would write and star in various sketches and plays, one of them titled The Mayor of Dixie in 1906. After Pekin, Miller and Lyles also took up on the Keith circuit, playing in theaters throughout the country, and in stark contrast to Sissle and Blake, much of their act was performed in blackface. As scholar David Thompson puts it, though, the team could be seen as pandering or subversive depending on the audience. While their look may have been typical, even stereotypical, their material set them apart. Miller and Lyles developed several routines that could easily be interpreted as either submissive or subversive depending on the audience. Variations in such reading would almost certainly fall along racial lines. Despite their differences, Sissle and Blake wanted to collaborate with the comedy team, so they decided to flesh out Miller and Lyles' old Chicago play, The Mayor of Dixie, into a full-scale musical retitled Shuffle Along. Rather than touting an operetta form as all other black Broadway musicals did before, though, Sissle and Blake's musical would be based in Tin Pan Alley, ragtime, and especially jazz. Shuffle Along tells the story of three mayoral candidates in the town known as Jimtown, two of whom are working together on a scheme that ensures that whomever wins, the other will be named chief of police. The crooks were portrayed by Miller and Lyles, of course. However, the third candidate, Harry Walton, is triumphant, and by the curtain's fall, Harry leads a reform movement and unseats the crooks. It was the flimsiest of plots, and the show consisted mainly of loosely connected vaudeville sketches. But this was not a deal-breaker for 1910s, early 1920s Broadway. In fact, other than the European-style operettas, this type of musical comedy was the norm, as it was simply a conduit for the popular Tin Pan Alley songs that made up the score. It would not be until 1927 that a long-form musical would tackle serious subject matter with the musical Showboat, and close to another 20 years later when musical theater would finally integrate songs into the storytelling with Oklahoma in 1943. Despite their faith in the material, the creative team knew they had their work cut out for them in securing an all-black musical in a legitimate Broadway house. The production kicked off with limited runs out of town in both Philadelphia and Washington, D.C., completely financed by Sissle, Blake, Miller, and Lyles' vaudeville earnings. And by the time the show arrived back in New York City, the production had amassed $18,000 worth of debt. Miller and Lyles utilized their Keith Circuit connections to secure white theater owner and producer John Court, who agreed to give the company a lecture hall a half a mile from the northernmost point of Times Square, the 63rd Street Music Hall. Finally, on May 23rd, 1921, the musical opened, and once the reviews rolled in, Shuffle Along became a bona fide smash with both white and black audiences, running for 504 performances and going on to gross around $8 million. Cast members included many of the greats of 1920s black theater, including Paul Robeson, Florence Mills, Lottie G., and an extremely young Josephine Baker.
Okay, so did this production give a historically accurate picture of what Miller, Lyles, Sissle, and Blake went through? Or was there any artistic license taken that you know of, or, you know, a little bit of both, a little here and there, a little zhuzhing?
Yes. I would say that the first act was very, very much sort of painted a historical picture, and I feel like it was mostly accurate in terms of just trying to figure out how these black artists got together and formed this foursome that created something monumental that shifted culture. And I would say the second half was very much based on truth, but it was heightened. There was a heightened sense to it, in the sense that George C. Wolfe wanted to hit home on the idea of just asking the question, what if the four had stayed together? And so Act Two is very much hits on conflict that was caused both by racism, and then the internal conflict that arises not just from racism, but also just personal ego and personal stakes that cause friction between one another, and what essentially drove that partnership apart. What I feel like George C. Wolfe wanted to do was indict both white Broadway and black Broadway. White Broadway in the sense that white Broadway, you don't know your history. You actually, you have stolen from a lot of people that you would attribute, you wouldn't know. And so you stole, and then also forgot your history and forgot some of the things that have actually made Broadway. So the world outside of Broadway that shaped Broadway. And then for black Broadway, just the sense of, and black artists, the need for, to continue to create new stories and to continue to work together to create something fresh and new. And and the power of unity in that, even in the midst of conflict. So I feel like those are some very deep issues that I feel like Act Two very much highlighted. But Act One was very much how everything came together. It was kind of a musical in its own sense, because it was how Shuffle Along came to the forefront and united both uptown and downtown and black and white, and made this transition from the norm being being Ziegfeld Follies, girls being paraded around the stage and doing nothing, and then one guy singing, to a chorus of people killing it on stage, hoofing, a chorus of women hoofing, and story being told through song and dance and syncopation.
There are at least 4 main reasons for Shuffle Along's success and influence. The first would be in the show's score, which has more in common with jazz and ragtime than anything that was currently being heard on Broadway. The showstopper, the Baltimore Buzz, was a syncopated foxtrot.
This is called Baltimore Buzz. This is where I was raised. Come on.
And the sincere Love Will Find a Way was the rare love duet between black characters. No shades of burlesque to cater to white audiences.
Love will find a way. Oh, I know it will, honey. Though the skies are gray.
But the show's runaway hit by far was I'm Just Wild About Harry, a song that worked its way into nearly folk song status through subsequent applications as varied as the Harry Truman presidential campaign and Warner Brothers cartoons.
I'm just wild about Harry. Harry's wild about me. I don't know the words, so I'll play the melody.
How was the music utilized in the show, especially since it incorporated songs from Sissle and Blake's catalog, not necessarily only from Shuffle Along?
I think it was just this combination. there were some original Sissle and Blake songs like "Oh, I'm Just Wild About Harry," which I never even knew.
That's the big hit from this show.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that some songs were told like a show within a show, as a part of a show within a show, and then other songs were told to help move the story along. And then there were some original arrangements by Daryl Waters and some of his associates. And Daryl Waters has been a part of so many incredible productions, and the man's a genius. Has been around for many, many years in terms of his work in the Broadway world as a conductor, as an arranger, and as a writer. So I think it really just depended on what the arc of the story needed. And so, yeah, there were some songs that were used as a part of the play within a play, and there were others that were used, just to help move the dialogue along as well, if that makes sense.
What's the word? More diegetically? Is that
Yes.
the word?
Yes,
No, sure.
yes. Because we have a show within a show kind of situation.
Yeah.
So it's like they're with like a backstage drama. So it's like noise is off,
Right.
but not zany. Yeah.
And the opening, and so for instance, the opening of the show began. Oh, it's all coming back to me. It began with a ghost light on stage, as that's sort of a standard tradition in theater, that when a show is done for the night, you put the ghost light out to kind of chase the theater ghosts away. And so there was this very kind of haunting feeling in the opening, and slowly but surely, all of the characters in the world of Shuffle Along, everyone that ever graced the stage of Shuffle Along, just in some way, shape, or form, whether it was like a tour of Shuffle Along or Broadway or whatever, they tried to kind of pull in lots of different voices. And so it starts with just this collection of kind of ghostly voices until we all trail on stage and we start to sing the song Broadway Blues as a company. And that was very much like break the fourth wall. So it begins with this, the fourth wall broken. You have a lot of our principal actors, so Brian Stokes Mitchell and Brandon Victor Dixon, Josh Henry, Audra McDonald, coming out on stage and essentially breaking the fourth wall to invite the audience into the making of Shuffle Along, which is very much like the first act. And so it's very much within the world of how Shuffle Along made it to its place of influence.
The second reason would be the show's innovative use of popular Black dance styles, particularly the buck and wing style of tap dancing. Although many of us equate tapping with modern Broadway, this was not always the case. Rather, the Ziegfeld Follies and the Elegant Follies girls were the norm, and with their elaborate costumes and headdresses, dancing was kept to a minimum.
Yeah, doing that walk to
Shuffle Along's Coreens, however, introduced a new kind of showgirl on Broadway. As the New York Herald Tribune's critic put it,
"They wriggle and shimmy in a fashion to outdo a congress of eels, and they fling their limbs about without stopping to make sure they are securely fastened on."
Tap those feet, Gerald. Yep. You can hear that. It's all right there with his feet.
You got some good feet. You got some good feet, Gerald.
Yeah.
Shuffle Along's choreography would directly influence Broadway for decades to come, as no less than Florence Ziegfeld hired Shuffle Along's dancers to teach his Follies girls. Indeed, white choreographers and producers were rushing to Harlem to capture Shuffle Along's energy and exploit it for their own.
You're a very, at least like when we were growing up, you were very like kind of classic style tap dancer. Like you could hoof it, but it's like old golden age movie musical style.
Yeah.
And Shuffle Along is famous for introducing kind of a lot of Black dance styles that were becoming popular in the 20s. Was that like comfortable for you, or was that out of your comfort zone, or was it like freeing? I just want to know what it was like doing these dances.
Yeah, no, I love that you asked that question. So, what I came to realize, because when we were in high school, I started tap dancing because of Gene Kelly, Sammy Davis Jr., and Gregory Hines. Those were kind of my three sort of idols, but I didn't know much history in terms of, where tap came from. Yes, I think I've always had more of a theatrical flair, but I realized kind of moving into things that I've always been a bit of a hybrid, So I've sort of had this one foot in MGM and the other in the Cotton Club. And then I realized it's because the fathers and mothers of tap dancing is very much an African-American art form that influenced so much of what we see, even in these golden age musicals, you know? And so when I first started tap dancing, I just saw the product of those things. I just saw footage and whatnot. And seeing the footage without knowing the history, I was exposed to lots of different styles. But then when I learned the history of tap dancing, I realized very much that, you know, Bilbo Jingles Robinson, for instance, like the father of tap dancing, was very up and very elegant, and yet had the feet as well. And so I realized that there were references to people outside of MGM that shaped the world of MGM before Singing in the Rain. And so when I stepped into the studio with Savion, I think, you know, this is only just a few years ago. And by then I knew the history of tap dancing. And so I very much felt comfortable because, you know, for me, it's not about figuring out what style you prefer, but it's more about knowing the history and leaning into that space in practice and in your journey as evolving as a dancer, leaning into the space of breaking down those barriers. You know, when you look deep enough into the history, everybody was hoofing back then.
Yeah.
You know, and so and the style was more internal as opposed to something that's external and put on, you know. And so so stepping into the studio, you know, it was exciting for me because I think Savion is one of the last living bridges into the past, because he got to work with all of those living legends. And so for me, he was like a living Rolodex, a living archive.
Yeah, because he was like mentored by Gregory Hines, right?
Yes, he was mentored by Gregory Hines and Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, in the movie Tap, he's literally dancing with the Nicholas brothers and Bonnie Briggs and all of these incredible, the Condas brothers, these incredible tap dancers that he not only had proximity with these people, he also had intimacy with these people in terms of being able to share so much time and space. So I was very much impressed working with Savion in the room because you saw he was able to identify which influence and from what person, from what ancestor of tap dancing. You know, he would do one step and the style would come out and you know exactly who he was doing and what it was coming from. And so his knowledge of where that came from was really inspiring. And yeah, it's just those moments where it just makes you hungrier to remember history. And it's a reminder that anytime you step into a room as an artist, you're also bringing an element of history into the room with you.
Oh,
so,
amen.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
4 cats, Gerald.
I know that now. I know that because of you, Emily.
I know. Yeah.
There was this period in which, you know, everybody was sleeping across borders and boundaries. There was this incredible cross-fertilization, cultural appropriation. It's like in the 20s, everybody had permission to visit each other's lands and see what they were doing.
This leads to the third major reason for Shuffle Along's influence, and that would be the all-too-common white fascination with exoticism. Jazz was gaining popularity with white audiences, especially in New York City, and it was not uncommon for wealthy whites to migrate to Harlem to catch a show at venues like the Cotton Club. Many clubs catered to white patrons looking for exotica in Harlem during the 1920s, and Shuffle Along was indeed a part of that experience. However, where Shuffle Along differed from the voyeurism of Harlem's white audience-only clubs was in the way the musical subverted white audiences' expectations while still working within them. While the show did portray elements of minstrelsy, Miller and Lyles appeared in their typical blackface look, the existence of earnest love songs like Love Will Find a Way smashed on-stage taboos of the expression of romantic love between black characters.
On opening night in New York, this song had us more worried than anything else in the show. We were afraid that when Lottie G and Roger Matthews sang, we'd be run out of town. Miller, Lyles, and I were standing near the exit door with one foot inside the theater and the other pointed north toward Harlem. We thought if Blake stuck out there in front, leading the orchestra, his bald head would get the brunt of the tomatoes and rotten eggs. Imagine our amazement when the song was not only beautifully received, but encored.
The production also employed a strategy of having the orchestra play without sheet music, an old trick Sissle and Blake picked up from their days with James Reese Europe, for as Blake himself put it,
the people wanted to believe that Negroes couldn't learn to read music, but had a natural talent for it.
What makes American musical theater, and to be honest, a huge part of that is Black contribution.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
what Shuffle Along did for me in a very official way was it legitimized I know it shouldn't take a show, but I guess it was because it was the first time that I was in a predominantly Black cast, and playing a role. William Grant Still was an artist that was stolen from by a very famous composer, and we deal with that in the show. And I won't mention the composer because I'm sure the estate would be happy. But in the show, we met in the show that person is brought up. I play a character named William Grant Still who would play in the pit of Shuffle Along. He played the clarinet, and so there's one moment in the show where UB Blake comes up from the pit and he's conducting, and you've got the Harmony Kings behind him, kind of singing behind him. Underneath this amazing monologue about William Grant Still, sort of watching in real time this monologue and watching his life through this monologue about how this famous composer came to Shuffle Along, not to see the show, but to hear William Grant Still play in the pit and realize that his song was lifted from the pit of Shuffle Along by this famous composer, and he turned it into a different song. And then I go into this dance of rage with a clarinet. And that was a very powerful moment for me, because I think, and it was actually one of the most memorable moments in the show. But for me, the presence of William Grant Still in Shuffle Along represented every African-American artist that mainstream media doesn't know about, who, beyond having to overcome racism, they were actually stolen from, and their contribution was never acknowledged.
It is also worth noting that Shuffle Along was one of the first mainstream musicals to integrate a Broadway audience. And while white and Black audiences rarely intermingled, with Black audience members mostly restricted to the balcony, it was still a major step forward.
We were afraid people would think it was a freak show and wouldn't appeal to white people. Others thought that if it was a colored show, it might be dirty. One man bought a front row seat for himself every night for a week. I noticed him. Down in the pit, you notice things in the audience. And finally, after the whole week was past, he came up and told me that now he could bring his wife and children because there was no foul language and not one double entendre.
And so I was curious how the show dealt with kind of those unsavory moments with the history, with the use of minstrelsy. So was it excised from the production? Was it addressed? Like, how did you guys deal with that?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. It's, because obviously it's a very sort of controversial subject, especially when you're dealing with a Black creative team and not wanting to shy away from history. So one of the reasons why we went to do research on Burt Williams is because as a silent movie star, he was one of the originators of blackface on film, and it was interesting. And not that I'm defending blackface at all, because I'm not. But originally, at least the way that Burt Williams portrayed blackface, it was actually to disappear. There was life and there was character behind that. Mm-hmm. And so if you watch some of the old footage of Burt Williams, it's not a mockery of culture, because it's a Black man wearing blackface. And he was a master at what he did in terms of that style, in the way that Charlie Chaplin was brilliant in a similar element, Burt Williams was. And so I don't think that blackface for him, he was just putting a mask on, but blackface in its evolution became derogatory when it was lifted by white artists to then make a mockery of what was perceived to be Black culture. And I'm not saying that I agree necessarily with Burt Williams' choice to put black paint on his face either. I still think that leaves room for questions. It doesn't take away from his brilliance and what he trailblazed, but it still leaves room for questions, because then you have this realm where, you certainly have given permission for people who are not Black to take something and then it becomes derogatory, and it becomes a mockery of not just artistically what was going on, but just in terms of our history. You had Black artists that were brilliant in reality, and they were made to be buffoons on screen, and people, for some people, that was the way that they actually at least in terms of captured media, that's the way that they bust wide open the doors for Black artists today. And in some ways, that's what they had to do. It went in the context of Shuffle Along. There's a monologue that Aubrey Lyles does. Billy Porter played Aubrey Lyles, brilliant in the role. So there's a scene where he is wiping his Black makeup off of his Black face. And while he's wiping his Black makeup off of his Black face, he's talking about a cotillion ball, which was sort of like a coming of age type of ball in the South. And it's a Black event. He's there, and it's sort of talking about colorism and how while he was there, he in the presence of other sort of lighter skinned Black people, he was made to feel inferior because of his Blackness. And the tension between Aubrey Lyles and Effie Miller, which is the character that Brian Stokes Mitchell played, is that you have Billy Porter, who's super, super dark, and you have Brian Stokes Mitchell, who's super, super light. And so I think one of the things that they were addressing was colorism. And so using blackface as a way to sort of hide behind that. And so it's layered, you know what I mean? I think blackface is always going to leave room for questions, because in my mind, and I think in everyone's mind, especially in this day and age, I don't think it will ever be justifiable.
No.
It was nuanced.
Yeah.
We don't need it, right? We don't need it. But in terms of legitimizing the circumstances that African Americans found themselves in that day and age, I think that there were a lot of conversations around colorism, around self-hatred, and then also around white perception of Black culture and the mockery of what was brilliant off screen and turned into buffoonery on screen by even some of the most beloved white stars who wore blackface and basically, weren't their finest moments.
No, and it was so just like, it was just commonplace. Like it was just an art form, you know, remember in White Christmas, they're like, weren't minstrel shows great? Man, it's so funny to think about how commonplace
Abraham, you're just like,
oh God, it's a lot. But
finally, the fourth reason why Shuffle Along was influential was for its effect on the Black theater community, as well as the fabled Harlem Renaissance. Poet Langston Hughes was a major fan of the show, not only for the songs and dancing, but for the outstanding array of African Americans who had brought it to the stage. Those creatives, specifically the four men who wrote the show, were intent on catering to both Black and white audiences. And as Thompson puts it, that meant including some of the staples of vaudeville Blackness, but steering clear of anything that might offend adherents of the new Negro movement. Every song that utilized a bygone image was balanced by a romantic ballad or a production number that gently refuted the stereotype. There were debates amongst the intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance as to whether Shuffle Along was helping or hurting their cause. However, the juxtaposition of minstrel show caricatures next to modern African American dance and innovative jazz made for an experience that showcased the best that Black creatives could offer on a New York stage in the 1920s.
Did you hear who was in this revival with Phillip? Brian Stokes Mitchell.
Yes.
Billy Porter.
Yes.
Brandon Victor Dixon. Joshua Henry. Adrienne Warren.
Okay.
Audra McDonald.
What?
Yeah.
Yes. She was pregnant on the Tony Awards and doing these kicks in the air.
Kicking her face.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
Just tell us everything you can about all the superstars that you work with in this show all the time, because I'm super excited.
Well, I'd say it was like a constant masterclass. I had met Audra before, and we had, I think before Shuffle Along, I found myself as a very lucky young performer. I found myself opening for her in Paris at doing a cabaret show. And so then getting to work with her in a Broadway show years later was wonderful. And then having both Audra McDonald and Brian Stokes Mitchell in the same room after, I was like reliving my high school dreams where I listened to Ragtime.
That was when we were in high school.
Yeah.
That was
We'd
like
listened to
Ragtime had just come out, and we were all obsessed with Ragtime.
It was wonderful, but it was also super tribal. And what I mean by that is that there was something familiar and comforting about being in an all-Black cast for a Broadway show where you know that your job is to bring to life fathers and mothers of Broadway that had not been received as such by the Broadway community. So there was something, it was kind of a holy moment actually for all of us to step into the studio the first time and know that your job was to tell the stories of the forgotten. And I think that brought us all very close as a cast. And I think, you know, Audra and Brian Stokes Mitchell and Josh Henry and Brandon Victor Dixon, and who am I leaving out? Adrian Warren. It was a wonderful experience to be in the room with, you know, Broadway royalty, and you know the story that you're telling, and you know, kind of with the story, you're not shying away from the adversity that Black performers have faced through the years. And so with that, you know, came sort of, you know, you have to kind of face those tumultuous moments and in order to do the work. But I think as a company, we'd circle up every night before a show and connect, and then we hit it. So.
Until very recently, Shuffle Along had faded into semi-obscurity. This is not uncommon for musicals written before 1927, as their structure is far from what modern audiences expect from a Broadway musical. Yet the show's legacy was also somewhat forgotten, especially in the wake of the popular Black musicals that emerged in the decades to follow. The same might be said for the 2016 revival, which closed abruptly after producer Scott Rudin decided to close the production early upon Audra McDonald's surprise pregnancy announcement. This is gross on a number of levels, not the least of which was that McDonald was always set to depart the production early to reprise her role in Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill in London.
And I think with Shuffle Along, I think it's a show that was beautiful and also a hard pill to swallow for some in terms of the indictment that it brings to all of the Broadway community. And so for that reason, it didn't run long enough, as long as it should have. But I also think it was hard for people to hear. Even just with that, you know, just the sense of it wasn't a show to see a company of talented Black performers perform. It was a show where through these elements of performance, we were kind of hitting home a deeper truth. And that's George C. Wolfe for you.
Essayist Catherine M. Young succinctly lays out exactly why the Shuffle Along revival closed, though. There are 3 important reasons a show as great as Shuffle Along is closing, and they don't involve a pregnant star. The show is expensive to run, maybe too inside for the casual Broadway consumer, and it could not get out of the long shadow cast by Hamilton. So, despite a fantastic ensemble, strong ticket sales, and a Drama Desk Award for Best Musical, Wolfe and Glover's Shuffle Along was pushed aside for flashier productions with more recognizable names so that the already rich producers would save some money. Young herself points out the historical parallels between 2016's Shuffle Along and the original 1921 production. The sourest irony of this situation is that Wolfe's Shuffle Along is a forthright commentary on the circumstance of Black performers caught in a commercial entertainment system that largely benefits white men. Rudin and the other producers' decision recalls this dynamic from nearly 100 years ago.
My favorite George C. Wolfe quote, I don't think it's an official one, but I heard him say it, and so it's forever sort of, I think it's like actually a little bit of wisdom, and I'll say it a la George C. Wolfe. He said, on the first day of rehearsal, I like to identify everyone's crazy and then not engage. I was like, I'll put that in my back pocket.
With the hand gestures,
and then not engage.
And then not engage, yeah.
And then not engage. I think also I was impressed with George C. Wolfe in the way he also wrote the book.
Yeah.
And so I was impressed with the way that he would write. You know, he'd switch hats from writer to director, and he was able to sort of separate his passion for the work as a writer from his role as the director to bring out the scalpel and cut what needed to be cut. He's, you know, old school in the best way, in the sense that he used previews in the way that previews are meant to be used. And that, you know, it's trial and error. And so we learned 9 new numbers and cut 9 new numbers. You know, I mean, every night during previews was a different show. We would come in, we'd learn a number, it'd be in that night. We were still in process. Like if it were up to George, I think we would have been changing things well into the process. And so I remember opening that, we're all circling up. And because, as I mentioned, during previews, we had a different show every night. And I remember Brian Phillip going, after we all kind of came into the circle, he goes, so George, I just have one question. And everyone, and George is like, yes. He's like, is the show frozen? Is the show frozen? You know. And then George looks at him and he goes, "There's ice."
Unlike that original production, though, Wolfe's Shuffle Along has had a bit of a resurgence in the past few years, thanks in large part to many of the main cast becoming huge stars, to a re-examining of every show that Scott Rudin had his greasy hands on, and to the Broadway community as a whole finally beginning to come to terms with its own history, which, yeah, has a lot of baked-in racism. Shuffle Along is a monument of Broadway history, and it should be analyzed alongside other great works of the era. But I think Phillip put it best.
I think a lot of times when we think of period pieces, we think things were a certain way. But the only evidence that we have are the pieces of media that were created by all-white creative teams and put out into a world that perpetuated a certain white story. So for instance, I think Singing in the Rain is a flawless story apart from the fact that it's all white. We see pieces like Singing in the Rain or Kiss Me Kate or any sort of piece that, because media says that the whole cast is white, that must be the way things were. But that's actually not the way things were, because you have an entire show called Shuffle Along that existed just after or in the midst of the Harlem Renaissance.
And was a hit across.
And was a hit across the board that impacted culture. It made monumental waves in ways that we will never fully grasp. Seeing Burt Williams and then being able to then embark on this journey of being an African-American actor in a show, a period piece that tells the stories of forgotten African-American artists and brings them to life on stage, it does something to you. Especially pre-2020 and then post-2020. For me, I'm interested in the world outside of MGM that shaped MGM, the world outside of Broadway that shaped Broadway, because what we have as evidence was controlled by a certain narrative in a time period where that narrative was alive and well and dominating. But now, I think our job as artists, before we can tell new stories, we actually have to understand how to tell period pieces in a fully truthful way.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we haven't actually done that yet. We have to come to grips with what it means to acknowledge contribution, legitimizing Black contribution, and recognizing that we can't fully know the story of American musical theater without acknowledging Black contribution. And if you're a director and you're directing a period piece, even if the piece has to do with racism and you have a person of color in your cast, you have to understand that that person is not just there and they're not just a diversity hire. There is justification for their presence. And as a director, it's your job to find it. And hopefully that actor learned long before I did that there is justification for their presence. But that's what Shuffle Along did for me. And I think everyone who came to see Shuffle Along. And that's my hope for theater, even post 2020, when, you know, a lot of the conversations that we had in code for so long, and now they're out in the open. My hope is that we learn how to tell period piece stories really, really well, so that we can fully own the power of new stories.